So you are a professor.
Right.
And you do research on your own and all that. We've got your book, The Consuming Instinct.
A signed copy for you.
You signed it already?
Signed it, and if I see it on eBay as a means for you to try to fund your Malibu house, I'll be upset.
No, don't worry about the Malibu house. I'm working on it in other ways. So tell me a little bit about what brought you to the world of academics.
So I've always known, there were two things that I was really good at and interested in: soccer and studying books.
Yeah.
I was certainly going quite, my soccer career was going quite well, but then I had some serious injuries and other circumstances didn't allow me to pursue that. And so that accelerated my move to academia. And so I always knew, I didn't even take any breaks between my degrees. I just went straight through to my PhD, straight to a professorship, because I never imagined doing anything else. In terms of the work that I do, if that's what we talk about. So what I do is I basically marry evolutionary psychology and biology to the study of consumer behavior. So the idea being that what makes us consume the way that we are is ultimately rooted in some evolutionary mechanisms. Why is it that men are the ones who are most likely to succumb to pornographic addiction? How do women's hormones throughout their menstrual cycles affect their behaviors as consumers? And so I look at these biological underpinnings specifically in the consumer setting.
So do you think that most human behaviors are linked back to genetics more than anything else? I know you've talked about this, and it's the nature versus nurture argument and things like that, but would you say that's really where the stuff we're made of?
Certainly there are the biological imperatives that are part of our shared, human nature, but there's always an interaction between our genes and our environment. And I always love to use the cake metaphor. So if you take the ingredients in a cake, the baking soda, the flour, the sugar, the eggs, they're each separate ingredients. Then you put them all together, you make a cake. If I were to tell you now, point to the eggs or point to the sugar, you wouldn't be able to. It's an inextricable mix. And so much of who we are is an inextricable mix of our nature and nurture. The problem with most social scientists has been, over the past 100 years, is that they have doggedly refused to accept that biology matters. And so their position has always been, evolutionary theory is relevant to explain the behavior of the dog and the mosquito and the zebra, but don't you dare apply it to human behavior. We transcend our biology. What makes us human is that we are cultural animals, and that's silly.
Well, if you were just to look at people being gay, wouldn't that be an argument against that? Right? Because wouldn't they, by that logic, they would say you could override it or something like that.
That's right, exactly. Of course, that's one example, but there's a zillion, right? It behooves one to understand how serious academics could genuinely believe that biology doesn't carry much importance when it comes to understanding human affairs. But it really originally started from a very good place. A lot of miscreants used evolutionary theory for nefarious goals, right? Hitler misused it, eugenicists misused it, social class elitists in Britain said, hey, the upper classes are better than the lower classes, who cares if the lower classes die? Hey, that's Darwinian. Of course, it had nothing to do with Darwinian theory, but because of all these cretins misused evolutionary theory, social scientists said, okay, well, let's create a new understanding of human nature where biology is no longer relevant, and hopefully there won't be these types of abuses. But that's silly. You have to root your science in logic and reason.
Yeah, so my whole direct message at the top of the show was talking about academia and sort of the ideas that are working in colleges and mostly that are not working, and the free speech problems we're having, which we're having hugely here in America, but I know it's happening in Canada too, and it's happening all across Europe right now. And you're right in the thick of that because you are outspoken.
Yes.
That's why we connected in the first place. I saw this guy on Twitter and I was like, wow, this guy gets it and he's not afraid to say it. So what do you think the general atmosphere, or talk about for your experience, what's the general atmosphere?
So you might have seen, I recently delivered a lecture at the University of Ottawa on political correctness and the thought police, and I gave many of these examples, which if they weren't true, you would think it's straight out of The Onion. It's really just impossible to imagine that the fulcrum has swung so much towards lunacy. I think we have to fight it. The reality is that most academics, I hate to keep repeating this point, but are afraid of their shadows, their careerists, to the extent that the general environment is you have to coddle the students, you have to infantilize them, don't you dare say something that might offend them. Then they perpetuate the problem. But if enough people stand up courageously and say, look, this is not right. As a matter of fact, I've had this discussion recently here with some college students, and I explained to them that it's not to your benefit to have professors be terrified to speak to you. There's a great article that I can't remember the name of the professor who wrote. He basically said, "My students terrify me." That's not a good thing. I mean, if you're a student, you don't want to hear that, right? You want professors who challenge you, who get you to move from your positions. If we are afraid to utter one syllable that might somehow necessitate you going into a safe space, it shatters the possibility for dialogue.
Yeah, so when you say that to students, I'm going to guess that on an individual level, if you're sitting across from them, they probably do get that. They probably do understand it. But that when you get them in a group and the group think starts, that's where it becomes dangerous.
The mob.
So how do you combat that?
Patiently, by demonstrating through evidence that this is ultimately suboptimal and it will only hurt your growth, right? I mean, people learn by engaging a diversity of ideas. I mean, that's what learning is about. And so, and I explained to them that I'm very open to somebody coming to see me and saying, look, I've experienced this and this trauma, and therefore I need this particular acquiescence. And fine, I mean, I'm an empathetic person, I'll take that into account. But to have, for example, a trigger warning that is sufficiently vague that it covers every possible thing that might trigger somebody, that's not a good idea.
Right, so let's dig into the trigger warning thing a little bit. So there would be trigger warnings, for example, if you were teaching a course and you were going to discuss rape. They would, a certain amount of people that like these ideas would want you to issue a trigger warning so that in case someone that was in the class had been raped or their mother had been raped or their sister had been raped or whatever it is, they would receive notice before discussing it. I know that doesn't sound terrible in and of itself, but it's the pervasiveness of it, right? It's the way that it then sort of shelters you from really dealing with hard topics.
And the reality is that it's not restricted to a few examples such as rape.
It becomes everything.
It's everything. As a matter of fact, I took it upon me to actually generate a list of topics that have been suggested as possible topics that would be worthy of a trigger warning. And actually, I covered that in my lecture.
Yeah.
And basically, those topics that I generated would pretty much cover anything that anybody could ever talk about.
Yeah.
So how could that be then? I mean,
yeah, I don't know how it could be, but yeah, and yet here we are. Where do you think this started? Because that's the part that I find really interesting, and I did discuss it a little bit with Tarek. Where did this idea that you have to be protected come from?
Right.
And how did it proliferate so quickly?
Well, I think it comes from different sources, but political correctness is really the impetus of all of these subsequent movements, right?
Yeah.
The idea that there are certain things that you should not say. And then we take this idea and then we say, well, there are certain things that you shouldn't say because it makes people feel uncomfortable, or it hurts them, or it triggers a past trauma. And so it becomes, the way that I've described it is, and it's a speculative hypothesis right now, but it's certainly worth testing. There's a phenomenon known as Munchausen syndrome, which basically says a woman, typically it's a woman who suffers from this disorder, will try to feign an illness to then garner sympathy. Then there's Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where you harm your child or your pet or your elderly parent to try to then garner sympathy.
Yeah.
Well, I think this type of crying for safe space is sort of this grotesque collective Munchausen syndrome, right? Where people get attention by constantly screaming victimhood.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a very alluring way to navigate through the world. I always get attention by saying that I'm offended, I'm hurt, right? Well, I escaped execution. I could still watch a military movie, right?
Right.
I want from now on, whenever I walk around in any city, you shut down all movie theaters that have military, because I was going to be executed in Lebanon.
Yeah.
That's it, do it.
God, I mean, it's really nuts when you, especially when you lay out like a great metaphor like that. It's like, this is, because we could all do this, and that's why what do they call it? You know, it's just like the afflicted Olympics or the
oppression Olympics.
The oppression Olympics. It's like it will never stop.
Yeah.
And I see this now as a disease that's running rampant, and that's why I talk about it so much.
Yeah, I can't imagine that this will continue. I already see a lot of academics write to me privately saying to me, they don't yet have the courage to come on board publicly, but they say, thank you for speaking out. Thank you for being a voice of reason. This has empowered me to try to be a bit more open. And I think all it takes is for a flicker to start, and then eventually I think the tide will shift back. I think.
Yeah, well, that's nice to hear that they're privately doing that. But do you get pushback from professors that think, Gad's pushing this too much?
I don't get it to my face because I'm a formidable guy to go against.
Right.
In other words, you better come with all your guns if you're going to do this stuff with me.
Yeah.
So usually it doesn't happen directly, but I will hear from sources that such and such person is upset that I'm taking these positions. So I know that there are groups that are upset with me, but they don't necessarily come to my face and say it.
Right. So this is a great argument for tenure, right? I mean, if you have tenure, right?
Oh yeah, since 1999.
Since '99. So when you got tenure, did that change? Did that moment? Did they hand you a paper? How does it work?
You kneel down and no. Well, it's actually a committee. It goes through several layers, and then finally you receive a letter saying that you've been granted tenure.
Yeah.
The process of applying for it is you basically give your whole dossier to demonstrate that you're worthy of that honor.
What are the protections you actually get for tenure? I mean, they just can't fire you just like that, but there must be some cause. What if they run out of money, if the university closes?
Only if your department would have to be closed for financial reasons, then that would be ground for then closing the department. The fact that you're tenured wouldn't protect you.
Right.
But the purpose of tenure is really to make sure that, let's suppose I'm doing work on evolutionary psychology, and the dean is a young Earth creationist who thinks that evolution is a Zionist hoax.
Yeah.
Right? Well, he or she can't come to me and say, hey, you better stop this evolution stuff because it offends me and it makes our university look bad, and I'll fire you, right? So tenure is a means by which you ensure that good ideas are able to be pursued, because oftentimes most of the important ideas are dangerous ideas. They're ideas that go against the orthodoxy. They're ideas that are considered heretical at the time, right? Think of Galileo, think of Socrates, right? And so the idea, oftentimes in political discourse, politicians will say, oh, we've got to get rid of tenure because all these fat professors sit around doing nothing.
Yeah.
That's basically them saying that they're idiots, okay? Because
it's them admitting they're not doing their job, basically, right? Yeah.
I mean, tenure is there to make sure that you could pursue dangerous ideas. Now, regarding my specific context, even when I didn't have tenure, I was outspoken. Maybe not necessarily about trigger warnings, because there wasn't such a thing then. But in other words, I never modulated my behavior, maybe to a fault. Maybe I'm not enough of a careerist. I don't care. The pursuit of truth for me is greater than any careerist considerations.